Hi everybody, Scott Hards here, and we are back from the Golden Week holidays here in Japan. Took the week off last week, sorry about that. When it's vacation time in Japan during the middle of a pandemic, or anywhere for that matter, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between the vacation and the not vacation. But that aside, we're mulling through, and I hope that you and yours are doing the same and staying safe and healthy during this crazy time. Now, if you watched our last episode, you saw that we got the tank all primed, and today we're going to finally get into the fun part, which is we're going to, paint the tracks too, but we're also going to work on the camouflage scheme on the paint. And, that looks like it could be kind of a hard thing to do, but it's really super simple. And I hope you can see that as I go ahead and demonstrate it in today's episode. And the reason it's so simple is that for tanks, unlike, aircraft or race cars, which have really precise markings and paint schemes, tanks were just, kind of anything goes. Most tanks from most countries are just one color, or they have a really simple scheme. In the case of the Jagdtiger that we're going to do here, it's only a 3-color scheme. And when you look on the internet and do some research about the markings of German tanks in World War II, you can see that it was totally all over the place. And obviously they didn't really have a manual or anything for how to do it, maybe just some general guidelines, but nothing has to be super precise at all. There's some examples out there, if you look around, of photos of German tanks or German military vehicles that look like some guy with a spray gun in one hand and a pint in the other spent about 5 minutes just going nuts to sort of do camouflage. Now, there's a lot of things that you can do if you really want to be precise when you're working with camouflage. For example, if you take a look at the instructions to the kit, you can see that the guys over at Takom spend a lot of time working with MIG, the guys who make the paint that we've been using, and they've researched very carefully exact examples of Jagdtigers from World War II, showing their exact numbers and the precise scheme that they were painted in. And duplicating an actual thing from history super accurately is a great fun for a lot of modelers. But I'm not really that kind of uptight about exactly how my models look or what they represent. I just want to have a cool looking Jagdtiger on my desk when I'm done. So just like the guys who were actually painting in tanks in World War II, I'm not going to worry too much about the exact scheme of this thing. I'm going to get it generally right, and we'll keep the colors reasonably accurate, and we're going to have a good time while we do it. So let's dive in. Okay, I got my mask on, and we're going to just test the airbrush real quick on a white sheet of paper and make sure I've got paint coming out, and it looks like we are. Now, I've mixed up a dark gray that we're going to use for the tracks on the tank, and that's the first thing we're going to do. Now, you could probably go ahead and brush paint the tracks on this tank, but I like airbrushes. So we're just going to go for it here. Now, as long as you keep the paint flow down to a low level and keep pretty close to the material, then as you can see here, it's possible to go ahead and spray pretty precisely without getting a lot of excess paint on other parts of the tank. Now, we're going to end up painting these other road wheels later anyway, so even if we do get a little bit of the track color on the road wheels, that's going to get taken care of later. You'll notice I'm moving the brush rapidly. Don't want to stay in any one spot for too long to avoid getting drips or runs or overspray. That's probably the biggest hazard when you're airbrushing. Alright, I'm reasonably satisfied with that for a first coat. So now let's just go do the bottom here. Even the bottom is a spot that you may not be looking at much when on the finished tank, of course. And as you can see, I've got some fingerprints and stuff on the bottom here that we'll paint over eventually. But again, it's an area of the tank you don't usually look at, so just not going to worry too much about it. Now, if you're looking real carefully as you're watching me paint this, you're going to see areas that I've missed or that look a little lighter. But again, this is a tank, and there's going to be some weathering and dry brushing that we're going to do later. And you don't really need to get too uptight about doing an exact, paint by numbers, keep it between the lines kind of an approach. Just get it in generally what are the right places, and the rest of it will take care of itself. You'll see as we finish the tank how everything, at least if I do this right, is going to come together and look okay in the end. You also don't want to forget that we have these extra track links, which are going to be going on the sides of the tank after we're completed, so we're going to go ahead and paint those too. But as you can see with the airbrush, when you got air coming out of it, you can just blow them right away. Now some people might take double-sided tape and stick these down in order to paint them separately, but I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to hold them and paint them. And if I see spots later that are problematic, I can always just touch them up. Alrighty, I think that's enough for those little guys. Okay, now that we have finished the tracks of our tank, we are ready to get started on the camouflage. And we're going to be using these three colors by MIG, Ammo by MIG, I guess is the official name. These three colors to do the tricolor scheme on the Jagdtiger here. And we're going to want to start with the lightest of the colors. Now the reason for that is because when you paint colors over each other, lighter colors have a harder time covering darker colors. So we will do the darker colors last and start with the lightest color because the dark colors will cover the light color easily. Now you'll notice, of course, the primer itself is a rather dark color and we're going to be painting a rather light color. So we'll have to see if these paints can cover themselves pretty well, but we will find out momentarily. So of course, as with any painting job, you're going to want to start out by, shaking and shaking and shaking, or stirring if that's your preference. Now these MIG paints come with a little steel ball, like some other paints do, inside the paint to help mix things up really well. Now we had such good luck painting the primer straight out of the bottle, as MIG says you can do that. We're going to go ahead and do that with the Dunkelgelb, which is the German word, I guess, for something yellow. I'm sure they'll point it out to me in the comments, but we're just going to put some of the Dunkelgelb right into the cup here. And then what we're going to do is paint the entire tank in the Dunkelgelb. We're going to start out in the delicate areas around the suspension by the tracks, though. Now, so I don't spill any of this paint while I'm working, I'm going to put the lid on my, my airbrush here. And we are going to start out doing the areas around the suspension here where the dark paint from the tracks is already present. We want to keep the airbrush really, really low power for this. So we're going to close it all the way down on the end here and then open it back up just a little bit. And of course we're going to see how it goes. So we'll get started by turning on the compressor. And of course we want to get started by testing on a piece of paper again before we go for real. Now you'll see if we get real close to the paper, we are in fact painting here. And that looks about right for doing the areas around the road wheels on the suspension, so let's get started with that. Now this may take a little bit of time because we want to make sure that we're not just going crazy and getting any paint on the tracks, which we have now gotten their proper color. Now you don't really need to worry about, again, keeping it exactly between the lines or anything, because some of the dark colors, either the primer or the coloring from the tracks, are going to make interesting weathering type patterns and make it look actually rather realistic. You also don't need to worry too much about getting back into the road wheels that are off the front row, because they're going to be in shadow anyway, and having them in a little bit darker of a scheme is actually going to look quite realistic. Alright, I think I'm reasonably happy with that effect for now. Now we're just going to, of course, repeat on the other side, and then we're going to do the whole body of the tank as well. That looks good too, and once that all dries, we'll come back perhaps for another pass after we see what it looks like when it's fully set up. Now let's get into the main body of the tank, and this requires, of course, a lot less finesse. So we're just going to open the brush up a little bit so we get a fatter stream of paint, and off we go. Repeating myself maybe for the third time, but always keep the brush moving and don't get too close to your work. Staying back 7 to 10 centimeters here as I do this. The paint is covering the primer reasonably well, but you can clearly see the differences in the coating thickness for areas where I've just hit it once and areas where I've gone over again and again. You want to get a reasonably even coat, but you don't need to go nuts worrying about having absolutely no splotchiness at all. In fact, a little bit of splotchiness is going to make your model look more realistic in the end. Now, to be perfectly honest, you probably don't even need to finish the bottom of your tank, but if it's going to bother you, or you think there's actually some people who might look at the bottom of your tank probably want to finish that too. So I'm just going to give it a light once over here. Okay, it looks like the Dunkelgelb that I've painted on the tank, the pale yellow that the Germans used, has dried nicely. So now we're going to go and start with the green. Olive grün. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Now, how do you do camouflage? A lot of people in the comments and in other places had expressed a strong interest here, and it's really not that hard at all. Now, if you take a look at the marking scheme, you can see that, of course, they've shown you how this particular tank was marked. Now, again, I'm not going to try to get super accurate on this. I'm going to get the general feel for the pattern that they've got going here, because, like I mentioned before, the patterns themselves, as they were marked on the tanks, were marked in just a very, very casual way. So the way I do this is I'll look at this tank and I say, okay, there's a green blob just above the first road wheel. There's a bigger green blob just above the second and third road wheels, or something like that. And I'll get a general idea of what I want to do. And then we'll go ahead and put that on the tank. Now, of course, to get started here, we've got to clean out the brush from the yellow. We've already taken care of that. And then I'm going to, of course, change colors here and put some of our already shaken olive grün into my airbrush. Now, for this part of the process, we're going to want to keep the pressure or the airflow pretty low, because we want to keep the paint exactly where we want to put it without any risk of overspray. Once again, put my cap on, test it on a piece of paper. Okay. Now, did you see what just happened there? This is a problem you sometimes have with an airbrush. It looks like I got some water in the compressor line, the air line. Now, how the heck do you get water in a paint compressor? Well, let's take this opportunity to explain. Okay, here's the compressor that I've been using for, heck, it must be about 15 years now to paint models with. And like any air compressor, shockingly, it works by compressing air. Now, maybe you remember from physics class that if the air is kind of humid and you compress it, you get condensation. And this is the moisture trap, which all good air compressors will have. And this thing is supposed to be preventing any droplets of water that are compressed or created by the compression from getting into the air hose here, which leads out of the compressor. But apparently that is not working perfectly, or I've just been using this thing so much today to paint my tank that there's too much moisture inside the trap and some of it is leaking through. So what I'm going to do now is take that off, clean it out, make sure we don't have any extra drops of moisture in the chamber, and also in the hose leading to the airbrush itself, and clean all that out, and then we'll attempt our green one more time. Okay, as you can see, I have cleaned all of the moisture out of my moisture trap on my compressor, and I also took the liberty of blowing some air through the compressor hose here with the airbrush removed, to make sure there was no moisture still in the tube. So hopefully we will be back on track here. Now, this is something that's almost impossible to avoid when you're using a compressor due to atmospheric conditions, especially when you're airbrushing in summertime. In fact, some more deluxe type compressors will actually have two moisture traps in an attempt to help prevent this problem, but it's not, in all cases, as we've seen, 100% preventable. You just kind of deal with it when it happens. So let's get back into painting some olive grün on this tank here. So what I usually like to do is do the outline like this first. And then it's just a question of filling in the blanks. Now that we're just filling in the blanks, I'm going to open the brush up just a little bit more so we can cover a little bit more ground a little more quickly. I'm going to adjust the shape of my blob here to get a little bit closer to what's on the instructions. And I've said this several times, but you don't want to get too uptight about what you're doing here, because basically the guys who really painted them in the war weren't uptight about what they were doing. Alright, that looks like a green blob to me. Now there's also one just over the first road wheel here. We'll go ahead and do that. Now you might be worried about some of the equipment and other details that are on the tank getting paint on them. Don't, because most of that stuff's going to be hand painted later, and we'll see that when we get to that step in the process. And then basically we just keep repeating this process as we go down the side of the tank. There's another green blob coming off the return roller in the back here. that heads up onto the side of the tank, so we'll go ahead and do that. And just kind of have some fun with the shape here. I kind of like that. Let's go with that. If you want to keep these edges between the different color zones nice and a hard line, or as close to a hard line as you can get with an airbrush, get close to your work and use a very small amount of paint, and you can get a pretty hard edge. So you can see we're starting to get a camouflage pattern going here, and we still have lots more to do. Well, that was a lot of painting we got done. What do you think? I think she's looking pretty good. We got the tracks all completed, we got the base color painted, and we got the olive grün, the first of 2 camouflage colors, painted. Obviously, we had a little bit of trouble with the compressor there along the way, with some condensation getting in there. You know, water kind of mixing into the paint and spritzing on the model. But fortunately, these are water-based paints, so it's actually not really a problem, even if you do have that kind of difficulty. And I hope you learned something about how to keep your compressor in good working order when you're doing that kind of thing. Now, obviously, you have one more color to go. We'll be putting the rot brown on in our next episode. And also in our next episode, we're going to move on to starting to paint the detail stuff, like the tools and the vents and the cables and all this other stuff that's on the tank. And I'll be showing you some basics about how to use brushes properly when you're getting that kind of work done. So until then, I want everybody to stay safe, stay healthy, and try something new once in a while. See you next week.